The biting cold of an April morning in 1945 cut through the dense Bavarian forest as Staff Sergeant James Holloway lay motionless in a shallow depression beneath a cluster of pine trees. The war in Europe was supposedly winding down, but someone had forgotten to tell the German unit entrenched in the village of Waldburg below. Holloway, a 26-year-old platoon sergeant from the dusty plains of Oklahoma, adjusted the focus on his binoculars, his breath forming small clouds of mist in the freezing air. He was technically only supposed to be on a routine reconnaissance patrol, scouting the road ahead for the 45th Infantry Division. But what he had stumbled upon was not a straggling unit of retreating conscripts, but a fully fortified defensive line that blocked the only pass through the valley. Through the lenses, Holloway watched the precise movements of a German officer pacing the perimeter of the village square. This was Hauptmann Stefan Muller, a veteran of the Eastern Front, who carried himself with the rigid discipline of the old Prussian military aristocracy. Muller was not preparing to surrender. He was positioning MG-42 machine gun teams at key intersections and directing the camouflage of a 75mm anti-tank gun near the church. Holloway felt a knot of tension tighten in his stomach. His own unit, Baker Company, was nearly 5 miles behind him, moving in a column that was expecting light resistance. If they rounded that bend in the road without warning, they would walk directly into a kill zone that Muller had meticulously engineered. The sergeant lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. It was 0600 hours. His radio operator had been hit by a sniper 2 days prior, and the replacement radio set was nothing but dead static in this mountainous terrain. He was cut off, alone, and staring down a German force that he estimated to be at least 200 strong. Standard doctrine dictated that he should retreat immediately, make his way back to the company command post, and report the enemy position so artillery could level the village. But Holloway knew the terrain better than the maps did. By the time he hiked back 5 miles, the lead elements of his battalion would already be entering the valley's choke point. He looked down at his Thompson submachine gun and the 6 magazines pouched on his belt. He had 2 fragmentation grenades and a singular, desperate idea forming in the back of his mind. It was an idea that defied every tactical manual he had ever read during basic training. Holloway wasn't a braggart. He was a pragmatist who had survived Anzio and the invasion of southern France by calculating risks. But as he watched Captain Muller confidently point out firing sectors to his troops, Holloway realized that the German officer's greatest strength, his rigid adherence to military logic, was also his only vulnerability. Muller was expecting an army. He was preparing for a regiment. He would never, in his wildest calculations, expect one man to launch an assault. Holloway pulled a map from his jacket, shielding it from the wind. He studied the layout of the village. The German command post had been established in the Burgomaster's house, a large stone structure with a clear view of the valley floor. The machine gun nests were positioned to cover the road, facing outward. Their backs were turned to the dense forest, where Holloway currently lay hidden. The sergeant realized that the very density of the German defense was a flaw. They were so focused on the approaching American army that their internal perimeter was porous. If he could get inside the village, right under the nose of that confident captain, he might be able to create enough chaos to make them believe the invasion had already begun from within. It was a suicide mission by any objective standard. But James Holloway had grown up playing poker in the bunkhouses of Oklahoma ranches, and he knew that the key to a great bluff wasn't the cards you held, but the absolute conviction with which you played them. He tightened the straps of his gear, ensuring no metal would clink against stone. He wasn't going to retreat. He was going to invade a German-held village of 200 men, alone. As the sun began to burn off the morning mist, Holloway slipped a fresh magazine into his Thompson, clicked the safety off, and began to crawl down the slope toward the lion's den. Captain Muller was about to have a very bad morning, though he didn't know it yet. The descent into Waldburg was a lesson in patience that would have tested a saint. Holloway moved not like a soldier, but like a ghost, placing each hand and knee with agonizing deliberation to avoid snapping the brittle, frost-covered twigs that carpeted the forest floor. It took him nearly 45 minutes to cover the 300 yards between the tree line and the first outlying structure of the village, a dilapidated dairy barn whose thatched roof had partially collapsed under the weight of winter snow. From this vantage point, the smell of the enemy was distinct and immediate, a mixture of harsh tobacco smoke, brewing chicory coffee, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Holloway pressed his back against the rough stone wall of the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was now officially inside the German perimeter. Just 10 feet away, a pair of young Wehrmacht soldiers were sharing a cigarette. Their rifles leaned casually against a water trough. They were speaking in hushed tones about home, about the rumors of the Russians in the east, completely oblivious to the American sergeant breathing the same air just around the corner. It was a stark confirmation of Holloway's theory. Their eyes were fixed so intently on the horizon that they had blinded themselves to the shadows at their feet. He waited for the soldiers to finish their smoke and return to their positions before slipping through a gap in the barn door. The interior was dark and smelled of old hay and livestock. Moving through the shadows, Holloway found a ladder leading to a hayloft. He climbed it silently, the wood groaning softly under his weight, a sound that made him freeze for a terrifying 10 seconds. When no alarm was raised, he crept to the loft window. The view was perfect. He looked directly down into the village square, where Captain Muller was now berating a junior officer for some invisible infraction regarding the placement of a mortar team. From this elevated position, the vulnerability of the German defense was even more glaring. The mortar pit was dug into the center of a flower garden, perfectly positioned to rain fire on the approach road, but completely exposed from the rear alleyways. Near the burgomaster's house, a tangle of field telephone wires snaked out of a basement window, connecting Muller to his forward observers. Holloway realized that before he started shooting, he had to sever the nervous system of this beast. If he could cut those lines, the coordination that was Muller's pride would instantly turn into confusion. But as he scanned the area, a new problem emerged. A German shepherd, likely requisitioned from a local farm, was tied near the command post entrance. The dog's ears pricked up, and it turned its head toward the barn, letting out a low, rumbling growl. Holloway instinctively tightened his grip on his Thompson. A barking dog could end this mission before it even began. He needed a distraction, something loud and disorienting that would mask his movement and pull attention away from the barn. His hand moved to one of the fragmentation grenades clipped to his webbing. He looked at the mortar pit, then at a stack of ammunition crates piled carelessly against the side of the church. The poker game was about to begin, and Holloway was ready to go all in. The German shepherd's low growl erupted into a full-throated bark, a jagged alarm that tore through the morning silence. Every head in the square turned toward the command post, and Holloway knew his window of opportunity had just shrunk from minutes to milliseconds. He didn't hesitate. With a silent prayer and a sharp tug, he pulled the pin on the fragmentation grenade, letting the safety lever ping off into the hay. He counted to 2, just enough to ensure the fuse was burning past the point of return, and hurled the steel pineapple through the loft window. It wasn't aimed at the soldiers or the dog. It arched high over the square and landed with a metallic clatter right at the base of the stacked ammunition crates near the church wall. Holloway dove flat against the wooden floorboards of the loft, just as the world outside turned white. The initial detonation of the grenade was loud, but it was merely the match that lit the fuse. A split second later, the stacked mortar rounds and propellant charges caught fire and erupted in a sympathetic detonation that shook the mortar from the barn's stone walls. The blast wave shattered every window in the square and sent a plume of black smoke and debris spiraling into the sky. The sheer violence of the explosion did exactly what Holloway had hoped. It bypassed the Germans' tactical training and tapped directly into their primal fear. In the confusion, no one was looking at the barn. They were all looking at the smoking crater where their supplies used to be, convinced they had just been hit by a heavy artillery shell. The sergeant scrambled to his knees, shouldering his Thompson. He knew that the shock would only last a few seconds before discipline kicked back in. He needed to turn that shock into terror. He leveled the submachine gun out the window and fired a long, sweeping burst toward the confusion near the command post, aiming high to shatter stone and kick up dust rather than trying to pick off individual targets. The chaotic rattle of the .45 caliber rounds echoing off the stone buildings made the single gun sound like a squad. Then, adhering to the survival instinct that had kept him alive this long, he didn't stay to admire his handiwork. Holloway abandoned the hayloft, sliding down the ladder and bursting out the back door of the barn just as German return fire began to chew up the thatched roof where he had been standing moments before. He sprinted through a narrow alleyway, his boots skidding on the cobblestones, heading toward the rear of the burgomaster's house. He reached the tangle of field telephone wires he had spotted earlier. With a savage swipe of his combat knife, he severed the lines, cutting Captain Muller off from his forward observers and his heavy guns. The nervous system was gone. Now the beast was blind. Inside the square, the confusion was morphing into panic. Captain Muller was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but his voice was lost in the ringing ears of his soldiers. Without the telephone lines, he couldn't confirm if this was an artillery barrage or an airstrike. And because Holloway had fired from the barn and was now firing short, controlled bursts from behind a garden wall 50 yards away, the acoustic distortion of the valley played a trick on the German defenders. To them, the gunfire seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. They weren't fighting one man. In their minds, they were being surrounded by an elite advance force that had somehow infiltrated their perimeter unseen. The bluff was working, but Holloway was down to 4 magazines, and the sun was fully up. Holloway didn't have the luxury of hesitation. He moved through the narrow gaps between the cottages, his boots crunching softly on the debris-littered cobblestones. The smoke from the ammo dump explosion hung low and thick in the freezing air, a grey shroud that obscured vision and turned the village into a phantasmagoria of shifting shadows. This was his greatest ally. To the Germans, the smoke concealed an attacking battalion. To Holloway, it concealed the fact that he was an army of one. He reached the rear of a bakery, the smell of burnt flour mixing with the sharp tang of cordite. From here, he had a flanking view of the 75mm anti-tank gun positioned near the church. The crew was in a panic. Without orders from the blinded Captain Muller, the gun commander, a burly sergeant with a bandage wrapped around his head, was shouting at his men to traverse the heavy weapon around to face the village square. They believed the enemy had breached the perimeter. If they managed to turn that gun, they could level the buildings Holloway was using for cover. He raised the Thompson. The submachine gun was a close-quarters broom, not a precision instrument, but at 40 yards, it was lethal enough. He exhaled, ignoring the stinging smoke in his eyes, and fired a short, 3-round burst. The German sergeant crumpled over the trail leg of the gun. The rest of the crew, terrified and leaderless, abandoned the heavy weapon and scrambled for the cover of the church steps. They didn't return fire immediately. They didn't know where to return fire. Holloway was already moving again, adhering to the rhythm of survival he had improvised. Strike, vanish, relocate. He sprinted low past a frozen water pump and dove into a woodshed just as a spray of machine gun bullets chipped away the brickwork where he had stood seconds before. He checked his ammo pouch. 3 magazines left. The poker game was getting tighter, and the pot was his life. In the command post, Captain Muller was slamming his fist onto a table covered in useless maps. His runners were coming back with conflicting reports, breathless and wide-eyed. One said the attack was coming from the north barn. Another swore they saw Americans moving in the southern alleyways. The severed phone lines dangled uselessly from the window like dead vines. "Find them," Muller screamed, his Prussian composure beginning to crack under the strain of fighting a ghost. "It is a commando raid. They are trying to decapitate us before the main force arrives." The irony was bitter. Muller was right about the intent, but fatally wrong about the plural they. Holloway caught his breath in the darkness of the woodshed, the adrenaline tasting like copper in his mouth. He needed to play his next card fast. He had 1 grenade left. He looked through the slats of the shed toward the parked trucks near the village exit, the only escape route back toward the German lines. If he cut off their retreat, they would fight to the death like cornered rats. But if he made them believe the retreat was cut off by a larger force, their will to fight might evaporate. He needed to simulate an encirclement. He unclipped his last grenade, weighed the cold steel in his hand, and looked toward the fuel drums stacked near the trucks. It was a long throw, almost 50 yards, but he had been a quarterback in high school before the world caught fire. He pulled the pin, stepped out of the shed, and launched the explosive in a high arc toward the vehicles. It was time to close the trap. The grenade didn't just land. It arrived like a verdict. It detonated between the fuel drums and the rear axle of the lead transport truck, shattering the metal casings and igniting the gasoline fumes in a split-second chain reaction. The resulting fireball rolled across the cobblestones like a living thing, a wall of searing heat and orange flame that instantly engulfed the only vehicles capable of carrying the German garrison to safety. Tires melted and popped with the sound of gunshots, and the ammunition stored in the truck beds began to cook off, adding a chaotic rhythm of random explosions to the inferno. To the terrified defenders, this wasn't just sabotage, it was the slamming of a prison door. The exit was sealed. The Americans were not just attacking, they were ensuring no one would leave Waldburg alive. Holloway shielded his face from the heat, the orange glow reflecting in his wide eyes. He had played his ace, and the table was now on fire. But he knew the flames would only buy him minutes before the shock wore off and desperation set in. Desperate men were dangerous men. He scrambled away from the woodshed, his lungs burning with the acrid smoke, and kicked open the back door of a two-story inn that overlooked the square. He needed height, and he needed a new angle. As he moved through the darkened kitchen, he nearly collided with a young German runner sprinting toward the back exit. The encounter was so sudden that neither man had time to raise a weapon. It was a collision of pure instinct. Holloway, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer momentum of his charge, drove his shoulder into the boy's chest, sending him crashing into a rack of copper pans. Before the runner could scramble for his dropped rifle, Holloway was past him, disappearing up the narrow servant's staircase. He didn't fire. He couldn't spare the ammo. And the silence of his movement was his only armor now. Upstairs, the sergeant kicked open the door to a guest room and slid across the floor to the window. He was now directly above the square, looking down on a scene of absolute bedlam. The burning trucks cast long, dancing shadows that made the German soldiers look like frantic marionettes. He could see Captain Muller standing near the fountain, his uniform stained with soot, waving his pistol and screaming orders that no one was following. The captain was trying to form a defensive perimeter around the command post, pulling men off the outer walls to face the internal threat. This was exactly what Holloway had gambled on. The machine guns that had been pointing at the Valley Road, the ones that would have massacred Baker Company, were being dismantled and turned inward to fight a phantom regiment. Holloway raised his Thompson, but his hand hesitated over the magazine pouch. He was down to 2 magazines, 60 rounds of ammunition against nearly 200 soldiers. The math was terminal. He scanned the room, looking for anything he could use. His eyes landed on a dead German sniper slumped in the corner, a casualty of the initial mortar explosion, or perhaps a stray round. Lying next to the body was an MP-40 submachine gun and a canvas bag of stick grenades. A grim smile touched Holloway's lips. If he used American weapons, they knew he was an enemy. But if he used German weapons, amidst the smoke and chaos, the friendly fire incidents would skyrocket. He slung his Thompson over his back, picked up the German submachine gun, and checked the bolt. It was time to make the Germans fight themselves. He leaned out the window and fired a long burst not at the soldiers, but at the cobblestones at their feet, sending sparks flying and forcing them to dance. The distinctive mechanical rattle of the German weapon echoed through the square, and the confusion on the faces below turned to horror. Now, they didn't even know who to trust. The psychological impact of that German weapon firing from the second floor of the inn was more devastating than any explosive Holloway could have thrown. To the terrified infantrymen in the square, the distinct, rapid-fire burp of the MP-40 signaled a betrayal from within. In the swirling smoke and adrenaline-fueled paranoia, they concluded that enemy commandos were not just surrounding them, but were already among them, dressed in their uniforms, using their weapons. The cohesion of the unit shattered instantly. A nervous machine gunner near the fountain, seeing movement in the shadows of the inn's doorway, opened fire. His tracers stitched across the facade, but they also cut down 2 of his own comrades who were running for cover. The scream of sanitator joined the cacophony, and the friendly fire incident acted as a catalyst for total anarchy. Holloway didn't stay to watch the fratricide. He knew that the inn would be targeted by every heavy weapon left in the square within seconds. He dropped the empty MP-40, grabbed his Thompson, and scrambled out the window onto a narrow slate roof that connected the inn to a row of merchant shops. The slate was slick with frost, and every movement was a gamble against gravity. Below him, the village had turned into a shooting gallery where the Germans were the targets and the shooters. Captain Muller's voice was now a hoarse shriek, barely audible over the din, trying to order a ceasefire that no one was listening to. The captain was watching his command disintegrate, not by enemy numbers, but by the phantom fear Holloway had planted in their minds. Reaching the end of the roofline, Holloway found himself looking down into the courtyard of the burgomaster's house, the very heart of the German command post. It was less defended than the square, as most of the guards had rushed out to repel the invisible attack. Only 2 sentries remained at the back door, looking nervously toward the smoke rising from the burning trucks. This was it, the inner sanctum. Holloway checked his last 2 magazines. He was tired, his knees were bruised, and his hands were numb from the cold, but his mind was crystal clear. He didn't need to kill 200 men. He just needed to take the head off the snake. He slid down a drain pipe, the metal groaning in protest, but holding just enough to deposit him behind a stack of firewood in the courtyard. The sentries were 10 yards away. They were distracted, arguing about whether to stay at their post or run. Holloway didn't give them the choice. He stepped out from the woodpile, his Thompson leveled. He didn't fire. Instead, he shouted the only German phrase he knew perfectly, learned from a prisoner in Italy, Hände hoch. The command, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who held the power of life and death, froze them. They turned to see a lone American, covered in soot, eyes wide with manic intensity, pointing a submachine gun at their chests. The cognitive dissonance was too much. In their minds, he was the point man for the battalion, destroying their village. They dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Holloway motioned them into the cellar with the barrel of his gun, locking the heavy wooden door behind them. He was now inside the command post. The cellar smelled of mold, stored apples, and the sharp, sour scent of fear from the two prisoners huddled in the darkness. Holloway didn't waste time binding them. The terror in their eyes and the menacing barrel of his Thompson were chains enough. He backed out of the room, jamming a heavy iron spade through the latch handle to seal them in. He was now in the belly of the beast, the basement of the very headquarters, directing the war against him. The floorboards above his head vibrated with the heavy thud of boots and the muffled shouting of officers, a chaotic symphony that told him the panic was reaching a fever pitch. He crept up the stone steps, leading to the ground floor, pausing at the top to listen. The hallway beyond the door sounded like a disturbed hornet's nest. He could hear telephones ringing unanswered, the crash of overturned furniture, and the distinctive, clipped bark of Captain Muller's voice dominating the din. The captain was demanding a status report on the northern flank, a flank that didn't exist, threatened by an enemy force that was entirely imaginary. Holloway took a deep breath, wiping the sweat and soot from his eyes. This was the most dangerous moment. In the open street, he had the advantage of maneuverability. Here, in the confined corridors of a stone house, a single pistol shot could end the game. He eased the door open just a crack. The hallway was filled with smoke that had drifted in from the shattered windows. A young staff officer, clutching a bundle of maps to his chest, ran past, heading toward the kitchen. Holloway waited for him to disappear before slipping into the corridor. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had accepted that he was already dead, and therefore had nothing left to lose. He pressed himself into a small alcove housing a decorative suit of armor, blending into the shadows just as two more soldiers rushed down the main staircase, carrying crates of documents. "Burn them in the fireplace," one of them shouted. "The captain says to leave nothing for the Americans." Holloway's grip on his weapon tightened. They were destroying intelligence. That was the final stage of a collapsing defense. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to hide the evidence of their defeat. He waited until the soldiers had entered the main drawing room, the impromptu command center, before making his move. He crept toward the double oak doors, now slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see the scene inside. It was a tableau of desperation. Captain Muller stood by the large fireplace, feeding maps into the flames, his face a mask of ash and exhaustion. A radio operator was frantically twisting dials on a field unit, repeating Waldburg to division, into a handset that offered nothing but static. Holloway knew he couldn't just burst in. There were at least 6 men in that room, all armed. If he entered, he would be cut down before he could clear the room. He needed to escalate the psychological warfare one last notch. He needed to make them believe that the hallway he stood in was already swarming with American infantry. He turned away from the door and faced the empty staircase. Then, summoning the loudest, most authoritative command voice he could muster, a voice he had honed drilling recruits on the parade grounds of Fort Sill, he roared in English. "First squad, take the upstairs. Second squad, secure the kitchen. I want flamethrowers on the front door. Burn them out if they don't come out." He punctuated the command by firing a long, deafening burst from his Thompson into the ceiling of the hallway. Plaster and dust rained down, and the noise in the confined space was thunderous. He then kicked a heavy hallway table over, sending a porcelain vase crashing to the floor to simulate the sound of a breaching team smashing their way in. Inside the drawing room, the effect was instantaneous. The radio operator dropped his handset. The soldiers near the fireplace froze, the maps falling from their hands. Captain Muller spun around, his hand going to the Luger at his belt, his eyes wide with the realization that the enemy was not just at the gates, but standing in his hallway. Holloway pressed his back against the wall next to the door frame, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He reloaded his weapon, his absolute last magazine. 30 rounds, that was it. If they rushed the door now, if they called his bluff, he would take 3 or 4 of them with him, but he would die in this hallway. He waited, the silence stretching out like a tightrope. He needed them to break. He needed the weight of his imaginary army to crush their will to fight. "Captain," he shouted through the door, his voice dripping with false confidence. "This is Sergeant Holloway of the 45th Infantry. Your building is surrounded. We have tanks moving into the square. You have 2 minutes to come out with your hands up, or we bring this whole house down on top of you." It was the lie of the century. There were no tanks. There was no squad upstairs. There was just one exhausted man with a submachine gun and an empty stomach. But inside the room, Muller was doing the math of a defeated man. He had heard the machine gun fire from the inn, Holloway's earlier ruse. He had seen his transport trucks burning. He had lost contact with his perimeter. And now, he believed an assault team was preparing to incinerate his command post. The bluff was solid, but would it hold? Holloway thumbed the safety off and waited for the door to open or for the bullets to come tearing through the wood. The seconds that followed were the longest of James Holloway's life. The silence in the hallway was heavy, broken only by the settling dust and the rapid, thumping rhythm of his own heart. Inside the drawing room, the decision was being weighed not on tactical maps, but in the terrified minds of men who believed they were staring into the abyss. Captain Muller was a disciplined officer, but he was not a fanatic. He had listened to the explosions destroy his transport. He had lost communication with his perimeter, and he now believed that an American assault team was poised to bury him under the rubble of his own headquarters. The facade of the invincible fortress had crumbled. All that remained was the instinct to survive. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy oak door creaked open. First came the hands, raised high and trembling, followed by the ash-stained uniforms of the staff officers. Then, Captain Muller stepped into the corridor. He looked diminished, his posture slumped, stripped of the arrogance that had defined him through the binoculars just hours earlier. He peered into the gloom of the hallway, his eyes darting past Holloway, searching for the squad of soldiers, the flamethrowers, the officers he had heard shouting orders. All he saw was one man, a sergeant, covered in soot, sweat streaking his face, holding a Thompson submachine gun with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. "Keep moving," Holloway barked, stepping back to maintain his distance, sweeping the barrel of the gun across the group. "Face the wall, hands behind your heads, interlace your fingers." He didn't give them a second to process the visual discrepancy. He knew that the moment they started doing the math, 1 man versus 6, the spell would break. He had to keep them in a state of compliance through sheer aggression. As the Germans lined up against the tapestry-covered wall, Holloway moved down the line, pulling Lugers from holsters and tossing them down the staircase. When he reached Muller, he pressed the muzzle of the Thompson into the small of the captain's back. "You are going to order a general surrender," Holloway said, his voice low and hard. "Right now. You are going to walk to the front door, and you are going to tell your men to lay down their weapons. If I hear one shot, just one, my tanks will level this square." Muller hesitated. He turned his head slightly, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. Where are your men, Sergeant? Where is the squad?" The cracks in the illusion were beginning to show. Holloway leaned in, his eyes wild with the manic energy of a gambler, pushing all his chips into the center of the table. "They are setting charges on the foundation, Captain. Do you want to argue with me, or do you want your men to live to see Germany again?" The lie held. The specific, brutal detail about setting charges was enough to bypass Muller's skepticism. The captain nodded slowly, a broken man accepting his fate. Holloway grabbed him by the collar and marched him toward the front entrance, kicking the double doors open. The scene outside was a portrait of devastation. The trucks were still burning, casting a thick pall of smoke over the square. The German soldiers, leaderless and terrified by the earlier fratricide, were huddled behind cover, aiming their weapons at shadows. When they saw their captain emerge, hands raised, followed by the grim figure of the American sergeant, a ripple of shock went through the ranks. "Cease fire!" Muller screamed, his voice cracking. "Put down your weapons. The position is lost. We are surrendering." The order echoed off the stone buildings. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, the sound of a rifle clattering to the cobblestones broke the trance. It was followed by another, and then another, a cascading metal rain of defeat. Men stood up from behind sandbags and fountain walls, their hands raising into the smoky air. They looked at the burning trucks, at the shattered windows of the command post, and finally, at the lone American, standing behind their captain. They waited for the rest of the American column to emerge, for the tanks to roll into the square, for the infantry platoon to march out of the house. But the road remained empty. The only thing coming down the steps was James Holloway, guiding his prisoners into the center of the square, his bluff having just toppled an entire garrison. But the danger wasn't over. Now he had to guard 200 men with an empty gun until the real army arrived. The silence that followed the surrender was heavier than the gunfire had ever been. 200 German soldiers sat in rows on the freezing cobblestones of the village square, their hands clasped behind their heads, a mountain of Mauser rifles and MP-42s piled near the water trough. Standing alone between them and their weapons was Sergeant James Holloway, clutching a submachine gun that was now little more than a 3-pound paperweight. The adrenaline that had fueled his one-man assault was beginning to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the Bavarian winter. His hands, concealed within his gloves, were trembling with the aftershocks of the bluff, and he had to lock his knees to keep from swaying. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The American armored column that Holloway had promised remained conspicuously absent. The smoke from the burning trucks began to drift away, revealing the empty road leading up from the valley floor. A murmur started among the prisoners, a low, restless tide of whispers that rippled through the ranks. They were veteran soldiers. They knew the sounds of an approaching army, the grind of tank treads, the roar of engines, the shout of infantry. But the only sound in Waldburg was the crackle of the dying fires and the cawing of a crow perched on the church steeple. The spell of shock was wearing off, and the dangerous logic of reality was beginning to set in. Captain Muller, seated in the front row, slowly raised his head. He looked at the empty road, then back at Holloway. The fear in the German officer's eyes was being replaced by a dawn of suspicion. He realized that no radio operator had called in the surrender. No advanced scouts had appeared to secure the perimeter. There was just this one dirty, exhausted American sergeant checking his watch with theatrical impatience. "Sergeant," Muller said, his voice steady but carrying a dangerous edge. "Your armor is delayed?" Holloway's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that if he showed even a flicker of weakness now, if he let his eyes dart nervously toward the road, they would rush him. 200 men against one empty gun. They would tear him apart with their bare hands. He forced a scowl onto his face, spitting on the ground near Muller's boots. "You know how the Shermans are in this mud, Captain," Holloway growled, channeling every ounce of frustration he had ever felt about army logistics into the lie. "They're probably stuck pulling the fuel trucks up the ridge. But don't worry. The P-47 Thunderbolts are circling overhead right now. If I wave my hand, they'll turn this square into a parking lot before you can stand up." He jerked the barrel of the empty Thompson toward the sky. It was a bluff on top of a bluff. The low cloud cover meant no planes were flying today, and Muller probably knew that. But the German captain blinked. The sheer audacity of Holloway's confidence created a shadow of doubt. Was he lying, or was he so confident in his air support that he didn't need the tanks? Muller looked at the sky, searching the grey clouds for the shapes of American fighter bombers. He stayed seated. The moment of rebellion passed, but the tension remained taut as a wire. Then, from the valley floor, a sound drifted up on the wind. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic grinding that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The German prisoners stiffened. Holloway felt a wave of nausea. Was it the distinct, high-pitched whine of American engines, or the throaty roar of German panzers coming to relieve the garrison? If it was a German relief force, his bluff would turn into his execution. He stood statuesque, his face a mask of stone, while inside he was praying harder than he ever had in any foxhole. The noise grew louder, clanking and mechanical, echoing off the canyon walls. It was the sound of heavy armor. The next 30 seconds would decide who walked out of Waldburg alive. The first shape to emerge from the valley mist was not the angular, menacing silhouette of a Tiger tank, but the rounded, olive-drab hull of an M4 Sherman. The white star painted on its glacis plate shone like a beacon in the grey morning light. For Sergeant James Holloway, the sight was so overwhelming that his knees finally buckled, not from fear, but from the sudden, crushing weight of relief. The tank, named Lucky Lady by its crew, rumbled into the village square, its 76mm gun traversing suspiciously toward the seated German prisoners. Behind it came the rest of the column trucks, jeeps, and the weary, mud-caked infantry of Baker Company, who had been expecting a fight, and instead found a surreal tableau of surrender. The arrival of the real American army shattered the last remnants of Holloway's illusion. Captain Muller, still seated on the cobblestones, watched the column enter. He scanned the trucks, counting the men. He looked at the single tank, and then he looked back at the empty windows of the buildings surrounding the square. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There were no flamethrowers. There were no other squads. There were no hidden charges on the foundations. There was just this one exhausted sergeant leaning against a horse trough, trying to light a cigarette with shaking hands. The color drained from Muller's face, leaving it a mask of ash and humiliation. He had surrendered a fortified position, 200 men, and heavy weapons to a ghost. "You," Muller whispered, standing up slowly, his eyes locked on Holloway. "You are alone?" Holloway finally got his lighter to spark. He took a long drag, the smoke filling his lungs and grounding him back in reality. He looked at the German officer, not with triumph, but with the tired pragmatism of a man who had just played the highest stakes hand of his life and won by the skin of his teeth. "I told you, Captain," Holloway said, his voice raspy. "I said the armor was delayed. I didn't say it wasn't coming." The commander of Baker Company, Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, jumped down from his jeep and strode over to Holloway. He looked at the pile of German weapons, the rows of prisoners, and the burning trucks. He was baffled. "Sergeant, what the hell happened here? We were prepping for a full assault. Who secured this town?" Holloway straightened up, saluting his superior officer. "I did, sir. I was on recon, saw an opportunity, and improvised." The colonel looked at the 200 prisoners, then back at his lone sergeant. "Improvised? With what, Sergeant? A division?" "No, sir," Holloway replied, patting the receiver of his empty Thompson. "Just a grenade and a lot of shouting." The story of the Waldburg bluff spread through the 45th Infantry Division like wildfire. Holloway was recommended for the Silver Star, though many in his unit argued he deserved the Medal of Honor simply for the sheer audacity of the act. But for James Holloway, the medals didn't matter as much as the lesson he carried home to Oklahoma after the war ended a month later. He never played poker again. He said he had used up a lifetime's worth of luck in one morning in Bavaria. Captain Muller spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Mississippi. Years later, in a letter to a fellow officer, he wrote about that day. He didn't describe it as a defeat of arms, but as a defeat of the mind. He admitted that he had been beaten not by a superior soldier, but by his own rigid expectations. He had prepared for the war he was taught to fight, not the chaos of a desperate man who refused to follow the rules. In the end, the liberation of Waldburg wasn't achieved by firepower, tonnage, or tactical superiority. It was won in the quiet, terrifying space between a threat and a lie. Sergeant James Holloway proved that, on the battlefield, the most dangerous weapon isn't always the gun in your hand, it's the belief you can plant in your enemy's head. And on that freezing April morning, he had planted a seed of fear that grew into a victory, silencing an entire garrison without firing the shot that killed them.